This is the Leadership Podcast, and we study leaders. This is episode 458, featuring Pippa Begg, CEO of Board Intelligence and co-author of Collective Intelligence, How to Build a Business That is Smarter Than You.
Welcome to the Leadership Podcast. Jim and Jan interview leaders who are blazing new trails. They'll read the bestsellers, they study trends, they'll provide thought leadership and the latest research when it comes to inspiring and leading others. They'll get you access to the great leaders of our time and help you learn from the very best. Now your hosts, Jim Vasilopoulos and Jan Rutherford.
Thank you for joining us today. This is Jim Vasilopoulos, founder of Rafty Advisors, and this is the Leadership Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Jan Rutherford, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership. Thanks for making us a part of your day as we study leaders. And you can get all our past episodes at theleadershippodcast.com.
Our episode today is brought to you by Darley. They're a wonderful company that supports our military and first responders with the equipment they need to ensure mission success, whether that's a water pump, a drone, or emergency medical supplies. Learn more about this fantastic company and the people supporting our nation's heroes at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com. Darley, you serve others, we serve you.
Our guest today is Pippa Begg, and Pippa co-founded Board Intelligence in 2009 with Jennifer Sundberg to transform boards with the science of board effectiveness. As Jim said, she's the author of How to Build a Business That's Smarter Than You. And one of her endorsements right on the cover is a past guest of ours, multiple time guest, Dan Pink. And he said, an essential guide to help leaders tap their organization's full potential. And Pippa begun her career in financial services, working for HM Treasury, Russell Investments, in a boutique hedge fund. She was recently a member of the CBI London board and is a guest lecturer on board effectiveness at Henley Business School. And Pippa holds a master's from Cambridge University and is a mom to 3 young kids. So Pippa, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what's not in the bio? What didn't we catch?
Oh, probably all of the franticness that sits around, as you say, kind of being a mum of 3 kids and running a business and trying to think deeply about, as you said, everything that pertains to the science of board effectiveness. And run a technology business that's, at the forefront of AI. But other than that, everything's totally calm.
Yeah. Let me ask you right off the bat, what do you know about AI and its application or use or future that you didn't know 3 months ago?
That is a really great question. So I think just the pace of change in AI at the moment is just eye-watering. So I think for me, just the ability. So we had been thinking, so we started our AI journey in 2022. So we released a product called Lucia, which was our first AI-powered report writing product then. And I could see then how, you could get AI to help you, not just with like summarization tools, but like critical thinking prompts. So helping the human author, in our case, authoring board papers, be smarter. AI could be its critical friend. What I didn't realize at the time was just the pace with which the world would change and how actually we would change the way that we engineered our products. So if you had asked me 3 months ago, I probably would have still been thinking, the thing that's going to limit our ability to release new AI features, let's say every fortnight going forward, is going to be our ability to find incredible engineers and our prompt engineers. Right now, I think the thing that's going to be on the critical path for us is actually the original research that we need to do before we even get to prompt engineering into the science of board effectiveness. Because the pace of change from a technology standpoint is so quick that I think the limiting factor is actually the unique insight and thought processes around what is the challenge I'm going to give basically AI to solve, rather than one's ability to put the effort into building the AI to solve that challenge, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. what I'm finding, I wonder if this will resonate or if you've got something you want to expound on, is it's almost like you can't keep up with it. I mean, you can feed it stuff and then, you get output and then it's like, okay, so there's something I can do with this.
Yeah.
And I can see where you can hardly even keep up with what you're asking it as a human.
Yeah. Exactly. So where we started our journey of like prompting people to write better papers, I'm now thinking actually, so we've always talked about augmenting. Basically, this should augment the human capacity in the boardroom. AI is kind of already smarter. And by that, I don't mean, so I think boardrooms should be full of like a load of bots and no humans anymore. But we know that humans don't take perfect decisions. We know that because we observe boards. We know about unhelpful decision making heuristics that we use. We know about bias that we have. The pace of AI development can call all of that out. So, really, the things that's blocking progress here is not even the pace of technology, it's the pace of human adoption. So, us feeling ready to let someone pass judgment on our decisions, us feeling ready for a piece of technology to say, you're falling into this decision making trap. Like you're using bad logic, you're using heuristics, you're unhelpful. This is the bias that's just come out in what you've said. And I think our readiness to embrace
Yep.
AI to help us be at the top of the game is the thing that's actually limiting progress at the moment.
Well, I've got another question. I'm going to get to Jim, and I am totally off script, which usually doesn't happen with our first question, but that's
No, this is
okay.
good. This is good
So,
stuff.
so I want to ask you, one of the things in my work is identifying really bad decision making and trying to help people make better decisions. What I find is way too often people use a T chart and basically say good, bad, it's binary. Very few people look at their own core values and say, hey, what's the criteria by which we should make this decision? And I mean, you can pump in the core values, you can pump in a couple criteria and say, here's the decision. And that will come up with way better options than humans. I mean, it will come up actually with options, whereas the humans basically go good, bad, do it, don't do it, pro, con. Are you seeing that?
Yes, exactly. And this is where I think it's, you know, this is scary for us. This is scary for us to see all of our flaws. Basically, we, as humans, right, when we're performing in business, we are better. We actually perform better when we're being observed than when we're not being observed, right?
Mhm.
But it is really scary to be observed. It's scary to be observed. It's scary to be appraised. But to your point, when we know that now the technology is good enough to pick up the flaws, if we are willing to expose ourselves to that and say, okay, so let's imagine we have AI in the boardroom and it is listening to the conversation and it will pick up you're falling into this trap, or that's very exposing, but it will lead to a better decision. And in my view, is that this year it is totally possible to be having basically AI tools that help us take much smarter decisions. And again, I'm not actually talking about automating the decision making in boardrooms yet. I'm just talking about whether we as boards and management teams are willing to expose our flaws and let technology help us take better decisions.
Yeah. This is so fascinating because I think about this. There are a couple different areas, but yeah, I think they always talk about successful people are great problem solvers. And, everyone wants a great problem solver, but I think the most successful people are great problem scopers, problem identifiers.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that goes back to, so you mentioned earlier the kind of the book that we authored. And one of the key premises in that is about the importance of the art of critical thinking and the skill that is critical thinking and exploring the question rather than just seeking to find the kind of the answer straight away. There's a brilliant Einstein quote, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the question and 5 minutes kind of on the answer. Yet in business, we don't do that. We typically spend very little time on the brief or the problem statement or the question that we're trying to answer. And we rush to find the answer. And often what we're doing there, we're rushing to find an answer to actually not quite the right problem because we didn't spend hard enough with those critical thinking skills and muscles, really identifying, as you mentioned, the scope of the problem.
Yeah. So what I find interesting about this, I mean, we're talking about this and we've almost got like this bias towards action. So we've got this bias towards action, which makes us want to jump into a solution before we fully understand the problem. But that's just one of many biases we have. Is we have this observer sitting in the room with us who might be AI driven, less driven by emotions than we are as humans. Is this observer really looking for cognitive biases and logical fallacies that we're falling into and trying to say, like, here are the logic traps that you're falling into, and here's why you may want to at least be aware of them, if not redirect it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd almost say it starts at an even more basic level than that as well. So, one of our observations about board decision making. So, you would be potentially horrified to know how many boards and leadership teams fall into the trap of, I'm going to say, not exploring options when they take a decision. So, again, if you think like, if you go through a critical thinking path, before we even get to like the biases around the judgments that we might make, you'd want to start with kind of like, what's the problem? What are the options that we explored to narrow down to what do I believe basically is the solution? The number of boardrooms and leadership teams that miss that middle step, even of what are the options. And that's such a critical path in the decision making process. So I think absolutely to the point that you're making, which is you can have AI essentially trained to look for decision making biases. There are actually a load of basic, much more basic flaws that we fall into in the way we take decisions in boardrooms.
Yeah. I don't know if this was a guest in an interview we had done recently or if this was in another meeting I was in, but and Jan, you can remind me if you remember
Mm.
this, but one of the best questions I heard recently that, I've added into my repertoire was, what options did you hear from your subordinates that you rejected? Like, tell me about the ones you rejected and why did you reject them? Just to kind of put some sunlight on, was there critical thinking? Was this a rush to judgment or was there critical thinking, just to validate and confirm that process?
Exactly. And I suppose the two bits that you talked about there, the option analysis, but also really keeping what were the ideas that came from people lower down in the organization rather than at the top. And I think one of the big fallacies, again, in business and the boardrooms is we hero worship, the
Mm.
CEO or the board for these incredible ideas and decisions that they must have taken because they must have superior IQ to everyone else. So many amazing business successes. The idea did not come from the CEO or from the board. So, Steve Jobs wasn't the man behind the idea of the iPhone. Warren Buffett didn't pick to bet on Apple. You know, Jeff Bezos, it wasn't his idea to do Amazon Prime. Those ideas came from the organization. And I think how one creates a culture, not just of critical thinking in the boardroom or amongst the mind of the CEO, but I think we believe firmly that those organizations that are enduringly successful time and time again, they have baked this thinking, this muscle throughout their entire organization. And the process by which they delegate problem statements and challenges as close almost to the coal face as they possibly can to get ideas that then need to then be taken again close to the coal face and then travel through the organization. That is what enduringly successful businesses do.
Yeah, it's so many of the people we work with struggle with delegation. And again, there is that hero worship, even if it's not like sycophants, but there's still that. And even, yesterday I'm looking at a bunch of questions that I came up with coaching somebody. I'm like, these are the questions the organization you guys should be asking. And it's a matter of literally not stepping back. I mean, what I refer to as addicted to busy or, the bias to action.
Yeah.
You were hinting at, hey, Jim asked about biases. And you said, hey, that's not even the big problems that we see. What are those big problems?
Yeah. So big problems. So I think basically there are three things that it all boils down to. So I'd say for some organizations, it starts with a simple thing, which is an inability to focus. And I don't
Yeah.
mean blindly focus, but I mean focus on what's important at any point in time. Then the second thing, which we've spoken a little bit about, which is critical thinking, the quality of critical thinking, and not just the quality of the critical thinking skills of the CEO and the leadership team, but the quality of critical thinking that happens throughout the organization. And we can talk a little bit more about the types of questions that we think are the most powerful. And then the third piece for us is communication. So there are great examples again in business where the first two, focus and critical thinking, have happened really well. But because of challenges in communication, that brilliant idea that has arisen somewhere in the organization, or that brilliant observation, has not traveled, and therefore it has failed. Xerox and the PC, a great example of an incredible idea and innovation that failed to travel through an organization for them to really then grasp the opportunity.
Well, you referred to that in your book as good thinking meets poor communication,
Correct. Yeah.
right? That's interesting in and of itself. And again, is that my bias goes, well, the good thinking is bottom up. And again, people do not have power and influence.
Yeah.
They do not know how to influence, and they'll play victim and say they. So do you think it's more complicated than that? Or do you?
Yeah. So I think good communication basically comes down to a few things. And actually, if I just share quickly how this plays out in the boardroom as an example for then what exists then lower down throughout an organization. So we've done a study of board informations with over 1,000 companies contributing to the research. And 2/3 of organizations rate the quality of their materials that their board receive as poor quality. So only a third think that they are producing quality communications at the very peak of the organization. When you start to unpack, like, what does poor quality kind of mean? So it's a bit about like length. So the average for a over 500 million turnover business, the average length of the board pack is 294 pages long, and that's 10% up on last year. So we are not, again, with some AI tooling, we're not becoming more concise. We seem to be becoming more verbose. Like, we seem to be having more information loaded into the board pack. Now, if you add in committees and stuff like that, you end up getting to kind of 600 pages that a board member needs to get through. That takes about 18 hours to read if you were to read it, right? So the reality is people aren't reading it. Then you add to this, over half of all respondents would say that finding the key points across those 294 pages is like finding a needle in the haystack. So if we go back to this, like, there might be some great thinking, but it is drowned. It is like in thick fog that it then becomes so hard to see it, even if, we're not even talking about people needing to be, charismatic and speak up at this point. We're talking just about kind of written forms of communication, that it becomes really hard to pull out basically those great ideas. And I think, again, one of our observations is often what you see at the boardroom is actually kind of I'm going to say slightly the best of an organization. So that thick fog that might pervade the boardroom is kind of even worse the lower down you get in an organization. So yeah, then if we bottle that, kind of what does good look like from the perspective of great communication? So if one has done the great thinking, then it is how concise, how precise can I be with my thinking? So we will talk a lot about bluff, not blab, right? So bottom line up front, in a sentence or two, you need to be able to kind of summarize that, the key essence of your thinking. Again, people aren't trained to do that. We're not trained to do that particularly hard through education. And it's not a good muscle that people have, or a good skill that most people have in organizations. So this, again, it's AI can really help us, right? AI can really help us here and has been doing for years. But then after that, can I make my message concise? So quite often I need to compel people to action. Can I inspire and compel people to action? most business communication is not written in the first person. It's not written in the active voice. Quite frankly, not very compelling. One of the first things about being compelling
Mhm.
is about bringing a bit of oneself, one's judgment to a great idea. And then there are lots of other principles kind of that follow.
Yeah, I'm going to toss this over to Jim here, but real quick for our audience, this podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, Darley, this amazing company based in America's Midwest. The peoples at Darley support our first responders, law enforcement, and military around the globe. So learn more at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And Pippa, I just kind of, my mind is going a million different directions now, which is great because I think this is a fascinating discussion. When we talk about communication, and maybe this is a bias I have because most of the board work I've done, in fact, except for nonprofits, like all of the board work I've done is been with companies that are not public. So they're not like they're in the startup phase, and a lot of the people on the board are investors. And so, it's one thing to have dialogue about communications, but a lot of times that boardroom is full of politics. And so there's a political element to this, which is difficult to navigate. And I think that creates a lot of complexity. You're obviously trying to make the boardroom more productive, more directed, more pointed. How do you factor in as you kind of pile on AI into this and try and make this experience better, the political aspect that really takes place? Because there's always, even I would assume in a public company, a very strong power struggle in many ways. So, how does that factor into the whole equation?
So, yeah, really good question. And again, now I'm going to begin to sound boring because I'm going to keep
Not at
talking about
all.
the principles, but it goes back to kind of focus and critical thinking. So most of the time when there is boardroom power struggles, it's because there's misalignment on what's important. There's misalignment on those really important questions or the scope of the problems that we're seeking to answer. So most of the time, it's not about the final piece of the equation around communication. It's around the focus and critical thinking. I can give you an example of this as well. So early in the days of the business, we're working with an airline, and some of the non-execs, so the independent directors, were driving the management team and the board crazy because they kept on asking these questions about, you know, let's think about profitability in Switzerland, or what's happening on the routes that go out of this London hub. And it seemed to be so in the weeds. It seemed to be so in the weeds. And every single kind of board conversation was going off track. And it came back to, I suppose, a fundamental question and challenge that some of the board members had, which was, do we really understand where we're creating or destroying value across this business and across the route
Yep.
network?
Yep.
But until they could articulate that was the question that everyone agreed was important, they were kind of pulling in different directions because someone would ask a question down the weeds and then someone else would be like, we shouldn't be down the weeds, we should be up here. And I think all of those, I'm going to say, politics and power struggles stem from not being able to align around the critical questions of importance for the value creation story of the business. And those questions should become the things that drive the agenda for the board as well. And one of the observations that we see is way, way too many boards have the same agenda. Habit and convention drives the boardroom. Now we'll have the CEO report, then we'll have the CFO report, then we'll go here, then we'll go there. And it all looks very similar. Whereas actually, what you really want the board to be focused on is what are those most important value creation questions that we need to be focusing on right now in our organization. And a lot of that is looking externally as well as internally.
So I love that. And I love this discussion because I think this is so fun. Now, let me throw a wrench in there a little bit because when we talk about, let's say, value creation, I think if we're stepping back and I'm just operating as a fiduciary of the company and the company's the best interests, the value creation is based on who are our customers who are going to give us their business so that we can create value for them. And if we're doing that right, our business will thrive. But we get into board situations where value creation isn't always the same for everyone, where you get someone who's in there is like, I'm trying to maximize my exit. I'm trying to maximize my position. I'm trying to maximize a valuation for the next round. So there's this value creation is like, especially in non-public companies, way more complicated. And even in
Well,
public companies, what I've seen is we're trying to maximize
sorry
the
to interrupt you, Jim. What you're getting at really is that value hasn't been defined. You haven't agreed on a definition of value, right?
well, yeah, but sometimes, I mean, I've been in operating in a public company where the value wasn't necessarily the whole discussion was not necessarily
Yeah.
on the customer. It was like, we need to do this because that will maximize our bonuses at the end of the quarter. And
That's
so
messed up.
trying to align people on that fiduciary responsibility, the real reason, is that more a function of board composition? Or can I overcome that with, can we use this technology to overcome some of those inconsistencies in alignment?
Really good question. I think the nub of the issue that you're getting at there is people's time horizons. It's short-term value creation versus long-term value creation, and how we deploy resources to maximize value creation on whichever time horizon we're thinking about there. And that comes back to the alignment piece. And it also comes back, right, to a certain extent, good governance. And this is defined in different regions in different ways. But for example, in the UK, boards have to take decisions in the long-term interest of all stakeholders. And again, we quite often have to remind people of that. And that, by the way, isn't for listed businesses. That is UK company incorporation law. So
Wow.
whatever size business you are, that's what should be guiding and governing what you do. But yeah, I think the biggest board conversation that should ever be had is around that. It's around aligning on value creation and time horizon. And to your point of how can technology help us, going back to if we are willing to expose ourselves, right, to technology helping us, we can hold a mirror up to our conversations. So for years, we've been doing this through our writing tools. Our writing tools can hold a mirror up and they can tell you how backward looking to forward looking your materials are. They can tell you how much good news to bad news is in your materials. They can tell you if you're missing critical thinking steps. But you can now also use all of that technology as well through transcription, through hearing how a meeting plays out. So if we are willing to expose our thinking, if we are willing to expose our writing, if we are willing to expose our conversations, then not only could we be prompted, but I think also just a really important piece of board effectiveness is we can just hold a mirror and just see what we're doing, really reflect on it, and then agree and align on whether that's the right course of action or not for where the organization is and the shareholder base that it has.
Yeah. Thank you. That was awesome.
Yeah. This reminds me of our interview with Lee Benson, who wrote a book, What's Your Most Important Number? And Lee, who I like and respect and admire, always talks about is everyone in the firm creating value? And, again, I think that's a really important topic. And I think it goes back to Peter Drucker's famous two questions. What business are you in? And who's your customer? And everyone thinks that you address those questions once and you're done. Those questions, as Peter Drucker pointed out, need to be addressed all the time. What business are you in? Who's your customer? And one of the biggest strategic discussions I see going on right now that it's just messy is, how are we going to source future clients? Like, where are we? We need to grow. Where are we going to get business? And that really goes back to who's our customer and what business we're in. But even fundamental to that is really describing, well, how are we going to provide value to them and differentiate ourselves? And all the board meetings I've been in, hardly anybody ever asks me a question. I mean, it's the board director's job to ask really good, smart questions. And to me, you know, the operational executives should be coming into the board saying, hey, you're up on the hill, you're separate from the business. Here's the questions we're pondering. Are these the right questions? Are there other things we should be thinking about? Anyway, that's a
You're,
question more
you're,
than a statement.
so you're bang on. So you're bang on. So we will talk about power questions, some of the best questions we've observed being used. And they are some of the simplest ones. So Stephen Hawkins would quite often say, I'm just a child that never grew up. I keep asking how and why questions. What you just described then are how and why questions. They are some of the simplest questions that are the hardest to answer and are rarely used enough in board and management teams. So again, we will talk about within performance reporting, every single time you want to ask yourself kind of why, what's happening, so what, and now what? And again, those are such simple questions, but that logic train is not followed. We present information, we forget, we spend so long kind of scrabbling around to find that information that we forget to then do the thinking around why, what's the root cause, kind of then what do I need to do about it, and the action that I'm proposing. And to the point that you make as well, so you made a really interesting point about quite often management teams will present informations for the board and wait for the board to ask questions. One of the key principles that we use through our products and through the advice that we give organizations is the start of every board paper should begin with, here's the input that I want back from you. So the board should be value adding. So the first thing the paper should do is ask a question of the board members.
Yeah.
And if you can't think of a question that you want to ask your board members, you shouldn't be writing a paper. You don't have a topic to write about, and you don't have an unanswered question in your mind. And the number of management teams that we will work with and we'll say, what's the question? What's the question you want to ask of the board? What's the input you want back from them? And they'll go blank.
Well, that's one of the things I loved about your book is chapter 5, conventions. Right under it says, what do we need to unlearn? I mean, so right away, you're primed to go, okay, I'm going to get the answer to this question. Let me ask you this, Pippa. As a former CEO, the hardest thing for me was to keep the organization focused, because part of your job was to be the visionary and chase shiny new objects and blue sky. And part of it was to make sure you hit your numbers. So you talk about that. What do we need to unlearn? In that you have the phrase focus but flexible. That's a really hard thing to do. And the word I've been using with my clients is adaptability, because I'm like, change and transformation makes it sound like there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there is no end. So, again, you say focus but flexible. So what do we need to unlearn about the way that we're going about these things?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. So
What's
focus
your question?
focus is absolutely critical to an organization's success, but blind focus can be its downfall, as we saw with Nokia, right? So how does one do both? Again, there are two simple questions that we would always ask about strategy. So again, if you had a strategy section of your board, what would be the two simple questions that we think you should ask? Are our key strategic initiatives on track? Question number one. Question number two, and is our strategy still the right strategy? And question number two doesn't get asked outside of annual strategy away days. And it's such an important question because it's the question that also stimulates what's happening in the outside world. What are our competitors doing? What's changing in the market? What might be coming over the hill? How might we need to pivot to stay relevant? And yet you would be horrified by how rarely we have seen that question outside of an annual strategy away day set piece process. How rarely we've seen the question asked in the boardroom.
Yeah. It's interesting. When you were mentioning that Stephen Hawking quote, which I really liked, it made me think of something that I think was a compliment. I wasn't sure it was a compliment at the time that someone gave me recently. And I was talking with a remarkable young man, super brilliant guy. And he goes, Jim, you have no ego. And I was just like, wow, I don't know if that's good or bad at the moment, but I think he meant it as a compliment. Now that I realize it, I think if you look at the world like a child, it's before you really have that well-developed ego, you can ask the question that could be perceived as dumb or simplistic or something like that. And I think about that and I go, wow, that was a lesson I probably learned too late in life. But, it's our job and what we do now is to help people see that earlier in life. What's maybe the hardest lesson you've learned as you kind of step back, looking at your career? I know you've got a lot of forward progress left in your career, but like, what's a lesson you wish you had learned earlier in your process?
So I'm going to say, I think there's lessons that I wish I had learned earlier. And there's a lesson that I think I need to continue to remind myself with age as well. So we observe, I think the exact point that you're getting at, we observe power corrupting people's intelligence. So we observe hubris in CEOs, in chairs, and in the boardroom all of the time. I think everyone should be aware that they are vulnerable to that and that your protection against hubris taking hold of you is having that mindset of continually questioning and continually seeking out answers from those around you rather than believing that you are the person with all of the answers. And it goes back to that enduringly successful organizations create this as a muscle throughout their organizations. And that's why they succeed, because great ideas flourish from lots of different places. And the moment an organization, those ideas start to be more singularly held at the top through a management team, through a boardroom, through an individual CEO, is the point where you know you've gone crazy. Because I see it so often, I want to absolutely protect myself from. And there was a brilliant piece, actually, a brilliant piece of PwC research that said 4 in 10 CEOs believe that their businesses will fail if they stay on their current path for the next 10 years. Okay. Yeah, this goes back to then, but how many of them are taking enough action through empowered great thinking, through speed and pace to change that? And I suppose what we see time and time again is essentially basically not enough happening. So that is, I suppose, I've given an answer which is potentially less the lesson I wish I'd learned earlier in my career and more the lesson I hope that I hold tightly onto as I age and go further into my career.
Yeah. The back cover, Pippa,
Yeah.
is it's so great. You don't have all the answers. I mean, you talk about hubris. This has been really great. I really can't wait for this to air so that I can make it mandatory listening for my clients and then have subsequent discussions and workshops. So you have just given us a great gift because you've made us think. And I'm wondering, this might be a big challenge, but I'm wondering, based on our discussion so far, and I think it's the most we've ever gone completely off of script that we ever have. And I think I've actually made the most notes of any guest we've ever had on. So those are two great compliments. But I'm wondering, for the benefit of us all, if you can do your very best to wrap this conversation with some closing comments and food for thought.
So I suppose going back to that point that I want to hold dear to of not ever believing that I have all of the answers. I think my kind of call to action for boards, management teams around the globe would be we need to let ourselves be vulnerable, to not have all of the answers, to create cultures where we empower great thinking, great ideas, better than any of our own to flourish. And that historically has been done through models of empowerment, systems, reporting, structures, cultures, ways we can measure and reward. Going forward, that will be done more and more so by us accepting AI into our conversations, into our writing, into our thinking. So I think the big thing for me is we are experiencing so many boards and management teams who I'd say are fearful of AI. They are fearful of exposing themselves to flaws in their thinking. They are fearful of losing their jobs. They are fearful of the world being run by robots. And I actually think the key here is we have to embrace AI with a learning and betterment mentality. And AI isn't going to automate the job of the board, but it could make us a damn sight better if we're willing to accept it.
Yeah. This has been a fascinating discussion, Pippa. I can't thank you enough for being a guest on our show. And I'm sure this will be an episode that gets a lot of re-listens as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
And for our listeners, that's all we got for you. But we'll have everything about Pippa and her book in our show notes on theleadershippodcast.com. And remember, what works at scale may be different from scaling what works. Rohini Nilekani.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Podcast. To listen to more shows or to access the books and content discussed on this show, be sure to visit theleadershippodcast.com. The material in this podcast is copyright by Rafti Advisors and Self-Reliant Leadership and must have written approval before commercial application.